houses and so on, and then took control of Crimea. Does that make sense? Yeah? So, on the one hand, we had like the UN and the general national community, they were really unhappy about it basically. They said that the referendums that said that people were happy to join Russia and so on were like illegitimate and invalid and basically like violating international law. So the international community is really, really unhappy. But on the other hand, there were a couple of referendums held in Crimea, and those yielded results of like 95% of the population wanted to join. So you have this conflict of, this is breaking international law, but it's what the people in Crimea want, right? I'm gonna go through most of this from a like, we're not okay with Russia kind of point of view, and then I'll go through and look at why maybe we do want Russia to take over Crimea. Yeah.
Why was it Crimea that they invaded and not another part of Ukraine? Like say the pro-Russian side?
Yeah. Well, Crimea is actually part of the pro-Russian side as well.
Okay.
It's sort of like that. But I think the main thing was because Crimea was like an autonomous region. So it's like, it's part of Ukraine, but it's also a bit separate and a bit more independent. And also I think because it's a bit separate and isolated, that movement was easier to achieve. Yeah. There's also a couple of like other strategic and economic reasons why people think maybe Russia had an incentive to actually invade Crimea. And I'll talk about that later as well. But yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. So, the main question with the referendums, when you make that argument that people were like, oh, 95% of people wanted to be annexed and join Russia, is that a lot of people don't think the referendums were actually legitimate, right? So you have the fact that there was no international monitoring. You have the fact that it was, the referendums were held in like a hostile military kind of situation, right? Where like, you've got forces from Russia in there being like, oh yeah, let's have a referendum. Do you want us to take you over? Also, we're already here. And there's a threat of like, if you say no, you're going to be taken or tortured or just like generally shunned, right? Nobody wants to be shunned. And then, yeah, there was also a lot of allegations of things like vote rigging or people who are non-supporters actually being violated or tortured and so on. But the main thing with that is that it's pretty likely at this point that Crimea is going to return to Ukraine. Russia has pretty much taken it over. The government generally isn't happy about it, but there's not really a whole lot they can do about it. So, after all of that stuff, we had a lot of continued and like escalating violence and conflict between the two halves of Ukraine. What basically made the international community really, really concerned was the fact that we now had like an amassed number of Russian troops on the border of Crimea, in Crimea on the border of Ukraine, basically ready to take over if they wanted to, right? Like they could just come in and take over the east border and there's very little we could do. So people were really starting to freak out, especially because we started having pro-Russian separatists actually taking over like government buildings in other parts of eastern Ukraine. We don't know if that's because of Russia or if that's just actual citizens in Ukraine who are unhappy and wanted to take over. And there's a big thing in here about like characterization in debates, because obviously you can have the really like far, I'm going to say left, but not in the typical political sense of like left and right, but just far to one side. You might have really, really, really intense like Ukrainian nationalists who will be violent, and on the other side you have really, really intense pro-Russian separatists who might also be violent, and then you might just have civilians in the middle who might have a view either way. So that's just something you guys should remember. But basically, they started taking over like parts, and people started worrying that like Russia was going to just annex the entire eastern half of Ukraine, and that's really not okay because we really support sovereignty and rights for countries to have like protection of their own borders, all of that sort of stuff, right? So the main conflict is that people who are living in the east weren't okay that power had shifted from like the East-oriented political like spectrum that was under the reign of Yanukovych versus like fighting between like pro-Russian separatists and Ukrainian security forces. So we know all that sort of stuff now, right? The third main issue, there's a lot of issues under this. Let me know if I'm going in a convoluted way or not making sense, but is it all okay so far? Yeah, okay. The third issue is that basically Russia really wants Ukraine to adopt a federal system, and that basically just means that the regional governments within Ukraine will have more autonomy over themselves as opposed to all coming from that like one government. And the reason that people think that Russia wants this, right, is because that way you get more support from the eastern side, because if they have more independence, then Russia can just be like, oh, hey, you know how you're really pro-Russian and don't have to obey your government as much, we can get continued support and cooperation from you all the time and basically use them as their puppets. Does that make sense? Yeah? So, that's really good for Russia, but the reason a lot of people are against that is because that's just going to make like the geopolitical, like social, cultural divide between East and West even worse, when basically what the West and also the West, us, want to achieve is like unity and democracy for Ukraine, right? We're generally not okay with like dictatorships. We're generally not super pro Putin. Putin? Putin. Gosh, that's a great name. Yeah, so that's basically the conflict between like Western civilization and Russia. So, why is Russia / Putin acting like this? The first main thing is like nationalism in Russia, right? They think that the people who are in the east of Ukraine are basically Russian citizens because they're ethnically Russian, they speak Russian, they identify as Russian, and therefore they need to be like protected, right? Because like the whole history of Russia is based on like protecting your citizens and all that sort of stuff, and there's a lot of ties that Ukraine is like significant in the origins and the mythology of Russia. And when you have really seriously pro-national, nationalist Russians, they think that taking over that part of Ukraine is going to bring something back to like the heritage of Russia and like the mother country. Does that make sense? They also feel like they have an obligation to like protect the rights of those Russian-speaking Ukrainians, because I think that these people are being oppressed by, you know, the West that is constantly encroaching on Russia and constantly like putting restrictions on them, and they're really not okay with that. Yep, and there's also the thing about like trying to restore Russia as a great power in the international community. The second thing, the second main reason that people think Russia is doing this is like the strategic territory type of stuff that I was talking about just before, right? So Crimea is in a really, really strategic position. So Russia has like a naval base just sort of here, and that allows it to have power on both like the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, and it thinks that that's a really like important place to protect Russian like national security and its borders and so on, right? There's also the fact that East Ukraine has shit tons of coal, iron, industry, like fertile land, as compared to like the West, which is basically just forests, right? Big resources, that kind of thing is like another reason why the West really doesn't want Russia to take over that bit, and why Russia probably does. So that's just another factor. Last factor, Putin is just crazy. That's also a possibility. So, like, he basically considers himself in, like, conflict with the constantly hostile and untrustworthy Western nations. And, like, that there's a conspiracy, basically, to suppress and oppress Russia and Russian power. So, maybe he's trying to gain back, again, that, like, Russia as a global international power kind of thing. So, how has the international community actually responded so far? Does anyone know? Yeah.
Economic sanctions on Russia?
Yeah, basically just lots and lots of economic sanctions. Although generally people have been like, oh, the economic sanctions are really weak, and they are pretty weak, right? It was basically sanctions not on the overall sectors within Russia, so not just like certain industries or anything, but they were actually targeting people in the higher bits of Russia. So like the people who are really close to Putin, they might have put travel sanctions on or economic sanctions on, so like freezing certain accounts, that kind of thing. So that those people in the high end were the ones who felt it. Any idea why they might have done that?
Because they have the authority to change the way Russia acts, and it's not worth like punishing the general population because they don't always listen to them anyway, like with the gay rights movements and stuff.
Yeah,
Russia
exactly.
didn't really care what people thought.
Still want to be in the campus.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's exactly it. So like they wanted to get the people who could actually, oh come on guys,
Camera shy.
who could actually make a difference, but they also didn't want to hurt the people on the ground too much. So for a while, Obama was under a lot of scrutiny, and people were just like, wow, Obama, you are so weak, what are you doing? These sanctions aren't even a thing. But it's been seen to be actually kind of effective, right? Because the sanctions haven't done much, because like those people are just like, ah, yeah, you're sanctioning me, huh? That means I'm a real powerful person in Russia. I take that as a badge of honor, right? Like, does that make sense? They're like, you targeted me. Yeah, damn right I'm powerful. But because there were all these like threats of like NATO and the EU and the US, these big powers being like, we might put more sanctions on you if you actually go further into Ukraine, and we're really not happy with you. The flow-on effect of that, which I found really funny, is that the international like traders and stock people, humans, I'm not an economics student, they started being like, oh, wow, okay, we don't know what's going to happen in Russia, we don't know what they're going to do, it seems really unstable, and it looks like there's going to be some serious economic sanctions. We're going to start taking like our funds out of the accounts we have in Russia. We're going to start like removing, like not buying stocks in there anymore. We're going to like take our money elsewhere. And that meant that like, it was like over a week or something, just the Russian currency, I don't remember what it's called, ruble? Yeah, ruble, like dropped, or well, increased, but basically dropped, the value of it by like twice or 3 times or something. And that basically meant that it was really hard to actually import things, made like the quality of life, not quality of life, cost of living.
Standard of living?
Yeah, basically. Really, really hard, and it meant that these people who were originally like, oh, we don't care, but that was their money that is now gone. And so like Putin had to actually prop up the economy with like, I think like 10 billion or 10 million. It was 10 billion or 10 million. One of those two. I mean, he has a reserve of like 500 million or billion. I get the M's and B's confused. But like at that rate, in one night he used 10 million/billion.
It's only the effect of 1,000, it's not significant.
Yeah.
It's probably billion.
Yeah,
it's a big country. Like.
Yeah. And so in basically effectively one night, he had to use that much money to prop up like the economy. That's a massive incentive for him to be like, oh, I'm going to step back a bit here. I probably won't go and invade Ukraine because that's not good. And the reason that it's particularly working is because now, as opposed to like during the Cold War, right, Russia is actually integrated into the global economy and relies on trade from outside people, as opposed to being really insulated within itself, which is why there was like no economic threat when the Cold War was happening. And also they had lots of missiles. They still have lots of missiles, but now they have like economic needs as well, so that's a big factor. Okay, so the main things to note with like international response, like, you know, most of Europe, most of like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, USA, all that, they actually condemned Russia and said that its actions were military and like effectively war. Then you had places like Afghanistan, Nigeria, I can't pronounce it, Russia, Syria, Venezuela, I actually haven't slept, so please don't judge me. Yeah. They were 5 UN member states, so actually part of the UN, who acknowledged Crimea as Russian territory. So they were like, okay with Russia taking it over. Most others, basically like China and all the others, a bunch did abstain, but most others were just like, we want Ukraine to have its sovereignty, but we're not going to condemn or anything like that. We're just going to stay out of it, but give some okay sentiments. But we had India and a couple of others recognize Russian interests as well. Those are just sort of like, if you need to argue from a certain perspective of a certain country, that's something to know where you're coming from. So yeah, we had sanctions, travel, we've already covered all that. Another thing is that there have been reciprocal sanctions on like US and Canadian like top people as well. To be honest, I just don't think it's very effective. There's an argument to be made, as you said, for why it's effective, but it's kind of just like, the Canadians literally responded the same way the Russians did. They were just like, yeah, awesome, I'm powerful. So yeah, it's not
Wait,
super.
So who placed these sanctions on Canada and the US?
Russia.
Okay.
So like certain things like flying over certain airspaces, or if they had like funds in certain banks that Russia might have owned.
Okay, so but the extent to which Russia could have affected Canada and the US, because it's one state against the...
Yeah.
Like if the EU decides to sanction you, that's... Yeah, anyway,
yeah,
I see.
It was basically just like, oh, you're doing that to us, okay, we'll do that to you too. Take that. And it was really petty and not effective at all. So, all of politics. Yeah. So another like main thing, well, it's not really a main thing. That's basically like everything I have to say in terms of like the basics of the Russian conflict. If you have a debate on Yanukovych, the other thing to remember is that he was both pro-Russian and very well known for being like hella corrupt and like vote rigging. So like I think in 2004 there was a thing called like the Orange Revolution? Yeah, Orange Revolution, which was like massive protests because he got in as president in 2004, but they were like, that is so like wrong because it was just all vote rigging and all corruption. And so he didn't actually get to be president in 2004. That was another lady who was also very corrupt. But then in, I think it was 2010, he did actually get voted in legitimately, and that's basically it. So, we know all the reasons why the West and most of the global community is just like, no Russia, this is not okay. But let's look now at like a couple of perspectives as to why maybe we do, or why we could argue that Russia should take over Crimea and possibly even parts of the East. So there's a couple of reasons, right? And I think in this, as I said earlier, it's a massive thing about characterization. So who you want to characterize the actors as, whether they're rational or whether they're really, really far right or far left, as in far east and west, is like very important when you're thinking of how you're going to approach a debate. So the first main thing is that if you take the perspective of people who live in the East, you're basically saying that like the West side's culture and language and political ideals have all just been thrust upon you, right? You were part of like something else for a pretty long time until these random like Democrats came and just went, oh, we want unity, so we're gonna make you do these things and we're gonna make you speak a different language to your mother language. And these people aren't really happy with that, right? That's not fair. They feel like they're being effectively, you know, like oppressed by nationalists under the guise of unifying Ukraine. And that's a legitimate argument you can make, right? Because especially if you characterize the nationalists as really, really nationalist, they basically take like rejection of Russia and Russia's culture as like a matter of faith, right? When it's like, we are so pro-Ukraine that we cannot have Russia, we do not want Russia at all, it means that those people who are technically Ukrainian are just like treated like shit, basically. Does that make sense? And that has happened. There's been lots of cases where like violence occurs both ways. It's not just like these crazy separatists going and being violent. There's lots of cases like the Odessa massacres, right? Where I think it was between 42 and 100 and something people were burnt alive and murdered inside a building for being pro-Russian. And if you want to look this up, it's a pretty interesting case because there's a lot of like conflicting news about who started it, like who did what, and like why it actually happened. So basically, the one of the versions, I suppose, is that first you had a bunch of pro-Russians shooting at like pro-Ukrainian demonstrators who were just doing a peaceful demonstration. Wasn't a whole bunch of them. The story is that it was like 4 or so people who were just like hiding and then sniping out people, basically, right? But then we had like pro-Ukrainian people who wanted revenge because they're like you just killed like 4 of our friends. So they went to a protest camp for the pro-Russians and they like basically torched it. And so what happened after this was those people who were pro-Russian all fled into a building, which was then like set on fire, and there were a lot of cases where people were like, we heard people dying and they weren't able to escape, and there's a lot of questions about why they weren't actually able to escape, right? Like, first there was the fact that there was a pro-Russian guy who was telling them to go into the building, and you kind of wonder, hey, why were you telling them to go into the building as opposed to running away, right? That seems strange. But then there's also, why couldn't they actually leave when the building set on fire? And that's because, theory has it, people were shooting at people who were trying to escape the building. And a lot of the people who actually died were civilians. There were pro-Russian civilians, but they were like kids and women who were pregnant, right? There's a really graphic video on that. Don't look at it. But it's basically evidence that there is serious violence against people who are pro-Russian, regardless of whether they're on the extreme side of the scale or whether they're just moderate civilians, right? So basically the aftermath of the like Odessa massacres was that the government promised that they'd investigate, but they're not doing a really good job, right? It was like 48 hours after the thing happened, that building was open to the public. When you do that, you kind of destroy all evidence pretty much. And the only conclusion the government's been able to come up with is like, oh, the police weren't very good. And that's basically their explanation, right? So that leads to 2 things. Firstly, we have like the pro-Russian side thinking that like their government is vicious and hates them and is like colluding with the extreme nationalists to kill us all off, basically, right? But on the other side, you have like pro-Ukrainians who think that this is just some kind of like conspiracy, especially given the evidence of that pro-Ukrainian guy who was a leader telling people to go into the building. It was like, oh, did these guys plan to sacrifice a bunch of their own people just to make pro-Ukrainians sound like horrible, vicious animals? That's such a Russian thing to do. This is why we have that conflict. And that conflict of the way people perceive events is something that's really causing serious like conflicts and potentially a civil war in Ukraine. But at the same time, I don't know. I don't know if a civil war is going to happen, I can't say. Yeah, does that make sense to everyone? Yeah? Okay. The second last reason for that is basically lots and lots of corruption and oligarchies. I think I pronounced that right. So in terms of corruption, we have Yulia Tymoshenko, who was a previous prime minister, who was massively corrupt. And you also have people like Arseny, why these names? Yatsenyuk, yes, who was part of her cabinet as well. And these people were the previous government, and they were corrupt. And then the government that came in after them, also corrupt. This doesn't really provide a particularly stable kind of environment, and it probably doesn't provide the best place for people on the ground to be living, right? But the other main thing is like you have oligarchs like, the main one I want to talk about is Igor Kolomoisky, who has so much money and owns so much stuff. He like, he's helped to arm pro-Russian troops, pro-Ukrainian troops, he's offered things like a $10,000 reward for any pro-Russians that, like leaders that can be found. He may have been involved in the assault on like Odessa, and he has massive amounts of information control, like almost as bad as Putin, in that like he owns like 5 different internet and media type companies, right? He has massive ability to filter content and have all of those propaganda type things coming out that we really hate Russia, right? So that begs the question of whether we want the people who are living in the East to actually be under control of people who are so far pro-West, right? When they're putting out rewards, when they're setting people on fire, maybe we should let these people go out and be part of Russia for their own good, to actually protect them, especially if that's what they want. So that's sort of like an argument you can make about that. The last one basically is just like, Russia doesn't really have an incentive to take over all of Ukraine, right? And this is in contrast to all of the stuff I was saying before about like resources and tactical advantages. The main thing is Russia is really big, and there are very, very few people per square kilometre. Like, I think you compare it, the border of like Russia to China is like one person, it's like 10 person per square kilometre, 10 people per square kilometre in Russia versus like 10,000 or something in China. And so Russia is really overextended. It's really hard to get resources out there. It probably doesn't really want to have to take on more land and more people, because that's just going to be more resources that has to direct outwards, right? And that's like the distribution, not great. Probably doesn't want that. So why would it be acting, right? It's probably because they want to just like protect the Russian citizens who are being like oppressed in poor Ukraine. Like that's terrible. We just want to protect our people. The other sort of sub-point within this is that you can make the argument that Putin has actually been pretty cooperative in the last couple of years, right? Like, he didn't make a massive outcry about NATO expanding its territory. He's been pretty nice about not threatening to blow up the world. Like, he's been pretty cooperative, ish, right? But when you have all of the West just constantly bullying like him and all of Russia and degrading them, like that's increasing massive tensions, right? Like when you think about it, if you wanna draw an analogy, like the reason we had a whole bunch of issues with Germany back in the day was because it was being like constantly like humiliated and being told, oh, we're gonna punish you for your bad behavior. And that's sort of like one of the factors that led to the whole, you know, Germany going crazy thing. So what I'm trying to say here is it worth the West constantly demeaning Russia and Putin when he's being so cooperative just for a section of land in Ukraine, right? Is it worth it when you think this is even, like Russia is even worse than Germany. If we push them too far, it's not just, oh, we're gonna mobilize troops. It's, we have nuclear bombs and we can like stuff up really badly, right? That is a massive threat. And do you want to actually provoke Russia to like snap, basically? Does that make sense to everyone? Yeah. That's pretty much it. There was a lot of content there, and I'm sorry I was just sort of going through it really quickly. The only other thing that I want to say is that, the one thing I want to emphasize is that this debate, and most debates about two actors in a conflict, are always going to be, like, come down to things like characterization. And so what I was basically saying here a lot was that the people in Ukraine and Crimea wanted to be part of Russia. But that's ignoring, A, the fact that the referendums probably weren't super legitimate, and B, that that's only taking into account like the majority. There is a minority of people, I can't remember what they're called, they're like two packs? No, that's a symbol. Basically, sorry. And they live in that region, and they have, like, they were massively oppressed back when Stalin had control like that area of like Crimea, they were basically like pretty close to genocided. That's a word. And now they're really worried that Russia is going to take control of that region again, and they're just going to have those same human rights violations. They're going to lose their like autonomy and ability to live normal lives all over again. Those people probably don't want Russia to take over their country again, right? So there's lots of different actors in this, and I think the main thing I just want to say is that there's lots of different actors. It's not just pro-Russian and it's not just pro-Ukrainians. It's on a massive spectrum, and there are lots of side branches as well. And on that note, I am done. Any questions?
Do you know why Russia gave Crimea to Ukraine in the first place?
It was as a gift, which sounds really strange, but it was probably just to like, I'm not 100% certain on this, but I'm pretty sure it was just like strengthening like the ties between them. Especially because like they were very recently split, and like Ukraine has a lot of resources, and they do have to cooperate quite a lot because oils run through both and like they share resources and they're very geographically close, so they probably just wanted to improve relations.
Okay. And do you know like the Ukrainian government does it tend to sway in the direction of one of the parties often, like even when the government changes hands, does it tend to have a leniency towards one side, or does it just alter?
I'm pretty sure until pretty recently it's been mostly on the pro-Russian side, but like the conflict is very sort of like, at this point I think it could go either way.
Okay. So it comes down to individual members of the government and their personal feelings. It's not like the political parties tend to align.
Well,
like
there's sort of
political
like
parties to get power.
There are like fairly distinct political factions, right?
Yeah.
Like effectively pro-Russian, pro-Ukrainian. But the thing about Ukraine is that there's a lot of like, it's not just the politicians, it's the oligarchs, so the really rich people who are actually like puppeteering them. And generally it does come down to like the West versus East divide. I don't know if there's more than two, there probably is. There's a couple of different parties, but they all sort of align somewhere along the spectrum on either side. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, so it's mostly, it's like a party bias rather than an individual bias that's sort of running it at the moment.
Kind of, yeah.
Okay.
But it's also, a lot of it is individual because it's presidential and so on.
Okay.
I think it's mostly regional. It's sort of like whether you come from one side or the other. Although of course in the middle you get other balance. But it's sort of like, yeah, it's kind of like parties, but it's also very cultural, as in like how you grew up determines which party you're going to be part of. I don't know if that answers your question.
Like whether you were sort of attacked by one of the sides growing up.
Yeah.
Sorry, also I don't know if you probably like talked about this before and I momentarily slowed down. With the like what actually started this conflict, so assuming that Ukraine is like obviously separated a while ago.
Yeah.
So what has caused this happening? What exacerbated it?
Well, it's kind of like there's been a conflict bubbling underneath for a really long time in that, like, when you think about it, 1991, that was only 20 years ago when Ukraine split off from, like, the Soviet Union, right? So there's going to be a lot of people who are, like, really, really pro-West because that was what drove the splitting off, right? Because they're effectively the majority and they wanted to become a free democracy on their own. But in 20 years, that's not enough for all of those generations of people who are effectively Russian and identified with the Russian culture to just disappear. And so they still have strong identity on either side, and both sides want the best for Ukraine, but they just have different views of how that happens. And I think, yeah, that's sort of like, that's a moderate view, right? They both just have different ideas of what Ukraine should be. But then, of course, you have like the really extremist groups on either side as well, and that's part of what is driving the conflict, because the extremist groups are obviously going to like be more violent and be more aggressive to each other. In terms of like actually Crimea and Ukraine, Russia coming in, that was, I think that was just like, that would have come after the President Yanukovych was kicked out. So he got kicked out because he was really pro-Russian and the people weren't okay with that. Then they put in a pro-Ukrainian government. And then I think probably because people in Crimea tend to be very pro-Russian, they weren't okay with the new government. And then they started making those movements, and those movements eventually built up into like separatists actually taking over that region, or Russia feeling like it needed to. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Cool. I think we